Hi everyone. In today's class, we're going to look at natural selection and adaptation. So first of all, the guy that you just saw holding the Pokeball was Charles Darwin. He's basically considered to be the father of evolution, but one of his most important published pieces of work was a book called On the Origin of Species. So On the Origin of Species was published in 1859. This was the world's first formal introduction to the idea of evolution, and it would forever change Charles Darwin's life. Evolution, according to Charles Darwin, is basically a theory where populations of species change over generations through a process called natural selection. So up until now, the word evolution has always been around, okay, but applying it to organisms was actually a big deal. Now, again, he's not trying to explain how life on Earth was created. He is simply making observations and making connections and saying that organisms on Earth, okay, different populations of species, they appear to change over time. Okay, and what's causing these changes, basically the whole mechanism for what's driving evolution, is something called natural selection. You may have heard of the term survival of the fittest. Okay, that's basically what natural selection can be reduced down to as a concept. So we're just going to expand on it a little bit and actually explain what survival of the fittest actually means. According to Charles Darwin, the fittest, meaning the most adapted individual, okay, in a population of a species in the current environment will pass its genes to the next generation. So if you're not fit, then you're likely not going to be passing your genes to the next generation. Okay. So in the end, it's nature that chooses which of these genes are added to the gene pool. Okay. And all of this is dependent on the organism's ability to survive. Now, not only do they need to survive, but the idea is if they do survive, then they're more likely to be able to reproduce and therefore pass its genes into the gene pool. Now, to give you an example of natural selection in action, we're going to look at the peppered moth, Biston betularia. Now, these moths basically don't look anything unique. Okay, they're not that special. However, these moths, they normally have a certain type of distinctive marking on their bodies. They're normally white with dark markings. Okay, and those markings are scattered across its wings as well as its thorax and abdomen. Now, here's the interesting thing. When you look at these white moths, okay, when they land on tree barks that are also whitish in color, okay, you can see that they kind of blend in very, very easily. It's very hard to notice where the actual moth begins and ends. So this is a very good adaptation for this moth. Okay, it makes it hard for birds, which are their predators, to pluck them off the trees, okay, as long as they land on trees with white barks. Now, unfortunately, due to pollution, soot from a nearby coal mining facility, it ended up covering all the tree barks, the white tree barks, and making them dark. Because of this pollution, you now have a white moth landing on a dark background. So right away, birds can see these moths and then eat them up. So now they've lost their advantage. This adaptation that they once had was very useful, and now it's no longer useful. So because of that, the number of white moths started to decline. However, by chance, okay, through a mutation, a black pepper moth appeared. So this is what the black pepper moth looks like. It's basically a dark moth. Sometimes it has like a bit of light marking on it, so it's almost like the inverse of the white moth. But because this black moth came onto the scene, okay, you can see how well this black moth now is able to camouflage itself in the natural surroundings. It only took 100 years, but the black moth had increased to 9% of the overall population of peppered moths. So only 10% of these moths are actually white. Most of them were actually black. Now, fast forward again, when the factory finally started to shut down, the amount of pollution decreased, and those trees that were once dark now came back as being white. Now, because of that, the white moths made a dramatic comeback. So their population started to increase. All this kind of tells us that nature has a very pivotal role in selecting the best adaptation. So the best adaptation for an organism to survive is actually dependent on what's happening in its environment. Okay? If they're better suited for this particular environment, it will do well. If it doesn't, then they're not going to do well. That is what we call natural selection. So since natural selection influences the types of adaptations, let's look at 3 different types of adaptations that exist. So an adaptation is any characteristic that allows an organism to be better suited to its environment. Okay. Evolution is not about creating the perfect organism. It's more about creating an organism that works best in its environment. So adaptations themselves are basically the result of natural selection. All the best adaptations basically allows an organism to survive, and because it survives, it passes on its genes to the next generation, and it just perpetuates that characteristic until the environment changes. Okay? If the environment changes and that adaptation no longer works for that organism, then it will start to decline. So I have 3 images here. They're all related to the very first type of adaptation that we'll look at. So you have bears kind of sleeping together, you have the leaves in autumn, and then you have these geese again in the fall. So if you kind of guess at what type of adaptation is happening here, well, this one here is called behavioral adaptations. Behavioral adaptations are any type of adaptation that involves how an organism responds to a stimulus in its environment. Okay? So, for example, bears hibernating, okay, that's triggered by a natural response in a change in environment. Okay? Now, there's also a second, I guess, defining characteristic of a behavioral adaptation. So, not only does it respond to something in the environment, but if an organism has some kind of instinctive ability, okay, some kind of ability that they were born with, that they don't need to learn, that's also considered to be a behavioral adaptation. And we'll again look at an example of that in a couple of slides from now. But the next slide here, we'll focus on some of the examples that we had with those images. So migration of geese. Migration is actually a very good example of behavioral. Geese are basically responding to the change in the amount of daylight that's present. So with less daylight, geese will now begin to fly south for the winter. Okay, we see that happening to our Canadian geese every fall. It also sometimes is dependent on the level or the angle of the sun. So it's not really about temperature. In this case, it's all about daylight. Hibernation. Bears hibernate. Okay, those are the most common ones that we're familiar with. But there's other animals that hibernate too. For bears, at least, hibernation is, again, dependent on the amount of daylight. But for frogs and snakes, these organisms, they base their hibernation on temperature. So a drop in temperature basically triggers their behavior to hibernate. And for other organisms, sometimes it could also be the availability of food. Now, like I said before, if it's not some kind of stimulus from the environment, then behavior adaptations can also come about based on instinct, okay, innate abilities that were pre-programmed into the organism from birth. And an example of this is birds or animals that build nests, okay, or dens. They don't need to be taught how to build this. They just know how to build it. So the innate ability for animals to create a space for reproduction or habitation. The second type of adaptation is called physiological adaptation. Now here, this involves an organism's ability to manipulate or alter its metabolism or biochemistry. So what this means is it could be an organism that produces a chemical, like a toxin or a venom. It could be an organism that is able to repel certain types of chemicals, okay, or resist certain type of chemicals as well. So, for example, antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Okay, bacteria that has been exposed to antibiotics. If there are certain bacteria that has developed a gene that can resist against things like penicillin, that would be a physiological adaptation for that bacteria. It's similar for pesticides. Okay, so insects or plants that are resistant to certain pesticides, they had to have shown physiological adaptations. Venoms and poison producing reptiles and amphibians. So there are two images of these tree frogs here. Usually their bright colors serves as a warning to other animals, telling them that these frogs are dangerous and poisonous to eat. So again, their ability to make these poisons to defend themselves would be a physiological adaptation. And then finally, bioluminescent organisms. So things like fireflies, jellyfish, any organism that is able to produce more or less a glow-in-the-dark type of chemical in their bodies would also be considered to be physiological adaptations. Now, the third and final type are called structural adaptations. These are actually very common. You should be able to pick out many examples from, just everyday animals that exist almost anywhere on this planet, okay? Because all this means is that it involves the shape or arrangement of physical features of an organism. Now, these physical features could be inside the organism or they can be outside the organism. The only rule is this structural physical feature has to help the organism to survive and or reproduce. So if we look at a dolphin's blowhole, a blowhole is basically like a nostril. We have our nostrils facing downwards or forwards underneath our noses, but for dolphins, it makes more sense to have them at the top of their head so that they don't have to necessarily come out all the way out of water. They can just breathe along the surface. So that's very helpful, and that contributes to their survival. So it is a structural adaptation. Cactus needles. Cactus needles, they're basically leaves, okay, that are reducing the amount of surface area so they don't lose a lot of moisture in the desert, okay, which is ingenious. Okay, so that structural adaptation helps this particular plant to survive better by conserving water. And if you look at something that helps an organism to help it to reproduce, you can look at a lion's mane. Most lions, if they have a very thick, rich, fluffy mane, the more beautiful the mane is, that is a way for male lions to tell females that he is the alpha male. he is the one lion that you should reproduce with because he has quality food and resources to be able to waste on looking pretty. Now, along with structural adaptations, there are two very specific types. Okay, so I call them special types of structural adaptations. The first one is called mimicry. Any organism that has physical structures or physical features that allow them to resemble a different species is basically called mimicry. So here we have an elephant hawk moth. So on the left-hand side, you have the caterpillar stage of the moth. This is where the mimicry is, okay? Because on the right side, this is what the moth looks like as an adult. But as a caterpillar, its distinctive markings on its body makes it look more like a snake, okay? Therefore, its predator, mostly birds, will choose to avoid this organism. And that's ingenious. Okay, resembling a different organism just to scare away your predators so that they can survive, that's mimicry. Another example of mimicry is what we see here. This is a stick bug. Can you tell where it is? It's right over here. So this long little stick bug looks just like a stick. Okay, it's almost indistinguishable from the actual sticks or branches that come off of this plant. So it is mimicking the branches of a plant. So therefore, it's mimicry. Now, don't confuse mimicry with the next one here. This next special type of adaptation is called cryptic coloration, otherwise known as camouflage. This allows an organism to blend in with the environment. So they don't resemble anything at all. Like this particular lichen spider that you see in the very center of this tree, it doesn't resemble the tree, it doesn't resemble the branches or the bark, it just blends in with the colorations of this particular tree. Another organism that does something similar is a zebra. So you're looking at zebras and they're like black and white, but it's the actual pattern and it's the contrast. Each individual zebra blends in with all the other zebras so that it looks like a large, much larger grouping of animals. So predators, when they try to target an individual zebra, it makes it that much more difficult to do so. Okay, so that's why this black and white pattern is actually a cryptic coloration or camouflage. Alright, so that's all I have for you today. I will try and post some additional optional videos on Google Classroom. Some of them are actually quite interesting, and I'm sure that if you do a Google search on for yourself, you'll be able to find even more interesting adaptations. Alright, see you guys next time.